Greetings, I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to today's Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations program. One of the major concerns today is that oceans are rapidly warming, and that heat is threatening essential marine plant life. Our guest today is here to explain why seagrasses are so important. Dr. Barnabas Daru is Assistant Professor of Biology and Curator of the Ruth O'Brien Herbarium at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. Dr. Daru is an expert on the evolution and role of marine plants and the conditions and mechanisms that promote their health and diversity. A few years ago, when Dr. Daru was a research fellow at Harvard University, he appeared on this program to describe how seagrasses maintain marine ecosystems. He's back with us today to explain why there is increasing concern about seagrasses as ocean warming accelerates. His expertise will certainly be essential in the coming years. We are especially pleased to welcome back Dr. Barnabas Daru. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thanks for having me this morning.
And now that you're in Texas and doing this, I will be happy to catch up with all that you are doing. But
absolutely.
First, I need to ask you a question from the layman perspective here. Now that there's more news on seaweeds, seagrasses now, Dr. Daru, I need to start with getting a distinction between some categories here. Apparently, there is a difference between seaweed and seagrasses that most of us on the outside are, uninformed about. Can you please tell us what the difference is and why that might be important?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are very big differences between seagrasses and seaweeds. So seaweeds, or as they are commonly referred to also, they are algae. And so algae and vascular plants are completely different, even evolutionarily. And so seaweeds differ from seagrasses in so many ways. For example, seaweeds, they have to anchor to some sort of a substrate at the bottom of the sea and they tap their nutrients via diffusion and other processes that is very different from from that of vascular plants. Whereas seagrasses are just like any other vascular plant or angiosperm that you can find on terrestrial environment. The only difference is that they are submerged in marine water. And so they undergo the same processes that pretty much almost every vascular plant, even on land, goes through. So those are the major distinction between seagrasses and seaweeds. So one being an algae and then the other being a vascular plant, and so on. They're very different evolutionarily as well, sitting on very distinct branches of the tree of life.
I see. There's increasing news. There's more coverage in the media now, but everything's called seagrass, and then they go to kelp.
Right.
That it confuses those of us who are not in this profession.
But absolutely.
Yeah, but if I use the word seagrass throughout here, is that okay? Because there seems to be a lot of emphasis on seagrasses and what they do. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Seagrasses, although interestingly, they are not grasses, but they belong to the order Alismatels, which are also monocots. same with the terrestrial grasses, that are also monocots, but they are totally very different to terrestrial grasses. But they are called grasses because they look like terrestrial grasses, but they are very different evolutionarily as well.
Aha. Well, in the ocean, we get some more on that too, but in the oceans, they have a really important role, apparently. And I guess that's what is causing this increased interest from the media, from the general media. What do they do that's so important?
Right. Thank you very much for this question. So, seagrasses, just like most vascular plants, are at the beginning of the food chain in any ecosystem. They are primary producers. And so, because the majority of the globe is comprised of water, and seagrasses turn out to be the only vascular plants that are found within the marine environment. And so, meaning they are also at the beginning of the food chain in the marine environment. And so, a food chain is simply a linear sequence of, different organisms feeding up on each other, and the seagrasses are at the beginning of the food chain. So they play key roles in the marine ecosystem, such that if there is anything that affects seagrasses at the beginning of the food chain, then it has these cascading effects on all other organisms high up on the food chain. However, seagrasses are often neglected in most of the conservation and restoration efforts in the marine environment, but they are very important for the same reason, for the same reason that terrestrial plants also play key ecosystem roles on land. For example, they provide food directly to most marine organisms like the manatee or the sea cow or the endangered green sea turtle. And even there is a shark, which is omnivorous, that also grazes on seagrass blades. So that's just one of the reasons why seagrasses are very important. So these animals are also being fed upon by other animals high up on the food chain.
Yeah.
And so there is a chain going on. Apart from just them being food directly for some animals in the marine environment, they also play other ecosystem roles. For example, the seagrass meadows or the seagrass beds are very important nursery grounds for fish and other fisheries, such that most fisheries use the seagrass meadows to lay their eggs. And then the eggs, when they hatch, they use the seagrass meadows to hide from predators. And apart from that, the seagrass community also harbours all other kinds of marine invertebrates, sometimes shrimps and
Yeah.
lobsters and other things. So each time one eats some sort of seafood, so always think of seagrasses because the seafood come from animals that live within seagrass environment. So there's a whole lot more functions that the seagrasses perform. For example, other ecosystem roles are carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they absorb all the excess carbon that is being released into the atmosphere, into the marine environment through human activities. And because most of human population across the globe concentrates around the coastal environments, so we're constantly pumping carbon and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, into the marine environment. So without this seagrasses being there to sort of absorb all this excessive carbon that is being released, then we are on a fast route to increasing global warming and other environmental issues that confront the globe. So they also help in nutrient sedimentation, they
Yeah.
reduce ocean acidification, and so on. So the ecosystem roles are so enormous. And because they are the only vascular plants found in the marine environment, it's just so important that they are given the attention that they deserve because of the ecosystem services that they perform. And even more recently, it's been discovered too that actually seagrass seeds can be food for humans as well.
Yes, I want to come back to that.
Right,
It'll,
awesome.
if I may. But while you are talking about that, they reduce the acidity, they are vital for so much of sea life, of marine life. So
Right.
it just leads to that. Well, I don't understand why it took so long for more public attention to this. That is to say, more attention in the media, the general science kind of information that goes out to the public. And you're starting to see it now. And is there any particular reason why they're finally getting to this, that we're getting more attention
Right.
to this?
Absolutely. So I have some possible explanations why this is the case. So, yeah, taken for example, in the terrestrial environment, so a simple food chain that comprises of terrestrial grass, the gazelle, and a lion. So there are three organisms involved. But when it comes to conservation activities, then effort is or attention is often focused on the lion and sometimes then maybe on the gazelle, but rarely is it on the grasses that
Yeah,
the gazelle depend on, and then the lion consequently depends on the gazelle to
yeah.
feed. So conservation efforts are often targeted at just the top of the food chain and then ignoring what's at the bottom. Now, if we go to the ocean, in the marine environment, the same thing plays out. So a simple food chain in the marine environment can comprise of a shark at the top, and then there is the green sea turtle, and then the seagrass at at the base of the food chain. But when it comes to conservation or other prioritization efforts, more often all the time, effort is mostly focused on the shark because it's so charismatic and it's so awesome. And then sometimes also on the green sea turtle, but then they often neglect the food that
Yeah,
the green sea turtle feeds on, such that the shark will then also depend on consequently. So, so put another way, why seagrasses are often neglected is because um, most of the conservation efforts are not guided by research, by empirical analysis of what actually plays out. So there's a tendency to guide conservation efforts based on political reasons or based on personal preferences at the expense of science. So those are some of the possible reasons why seagrasses have been neglected and not
I
given.
see. Well, now too, there, I guess with threats to the coast, and many of these seagrasses are really in the coastal waters, I think, double check that with you,
Right.
but rising temperatures, and that threatens these grasses. But evidently, there's a lot of concern about fertilizer runoff, topsoil runoff, overfishing. All these things are impacting this, that is it that the seagrasses are really threatened now?
Right. Yeah. So absolutely. So all these effects, all these pollutants that have been released into the marine environment, for example, carbon, in general, the respiratory pathways for plants are different from that of animals. For example,
Hmm.
animals breathe in oxygen and release carbon dioxide, but for plants, under certain circumstances, plants take in carbon dioxide and sort of release oxygen. And so, but when it becomes excessive, that the plants cannot bear, then that's where it becomes problematic. And so the amount of carbon and all these pollutants that are being released are getting to a rate that is way beyond the carrying capacity of the seagrasses,
Ah.
in terms of processing the excess that is being released. And at the same time, even the habitats of seagrasses are also being affected. So their ranges are contracting. For
Mm.
example, while in a terrestrial environment, under climate change or under global warming, species tend to move from places that are very hot to places that are cooler with cooler climates. And so there's a tendency for organisms to sort of move towards higher latitudes because the equatorial regions are much hotter. And so there's a tendency for things to either move towards higher latitudes in the temperate region, or they move towards higher altitude, towards mountaintops, because the higher you go, the cooler it becomes.
Yeah.
But in the marine environment, the habitats are different because species can have almost four directions in which they can move. They can either try to move toward land as sea levels rise, or they can move further deep into the ocean. And that means then the depth also increases, and then light does not get to the bottom of the seafloor where they can photosynthesize, or they can move uh, towards the poles where it's cooler, on the opposite side. So the directionality of the movement and response of seagrasses with climate change is not very straightforward as it is for terrestrial environments. And so that's why it's so worrying, and it's important to understand how they would respond to all these changes that they are facing as a result of human activities through fertilizer release or nutrient release or pollution or excessive carbon that is being released to the environment. So seagrasses are, having a hard time coping with all this. And remember, because they also need to photosynthesize, meaning they use sunlight energy to manufacture their own food in the presence of inorganic chemicals. But then if the water is polluted due to so many things or algal blooms and other things, then because seagrasses are plants that have roots, and meaning their roots are at the bottom of the seafloor, so meaning they are also found submerged in the marine environment at the seafloor. So meaning sunlight cannot reach them to be able to photosynthesize. And without photosynthesis, then they cannot also feed, because photosynthesis is the way that they make their own food, from inorganic, materials. And so then that means their populations will now start to decline, and they are reducing at the rates at which they are going.
So this sounds like a really large threat, large crisis and large threat. And
Right.
just would like to insert that apparently there's a lot of difficulty around like the Florida, the Gulf of Mexico. All this was speaking of, the problem of this algae on top so that the sunlight cannot penetrate so easily to these plants. So this is a really huge problem because
Absolutely.
complicated by so many things. Well, Dr. Daru, is there, what are the restoration efforts? Because they can't get up and walk away, these plants. They have they're stuck. What can they do? What are they doing? What is being done rather to try to restore them or keep them going?
Right, absolutely. There are, well, the good news is that all hope is not lost. As,
Oh,
as you said, there's always something we can do. And already there are some efforts along these lines that are geared toward restoring seagrass communities. For example, there's one in Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. And this is a long-term research that has, they literally planted seagrasses, along that area, as a way of restoring them back to, historical levels. And and there has been a really great success along those lines, in the restoration efforts. There are some other restoration efforts also along the coast of Australia, where most seagrass diversity concentrates. That's also a really big step in that direction. There are also some restoration efforts around some coast of Africa as well, which is really great. And the good news also is that seagrasses, they are pretty resilient. They can bounce back pretty quickly. And so if we put in, just the smallest efforts, then they can sort of spring back even on their own and then start to flourish once again. But the problem is that seagrasses are distributed almost across the globe. They have a global distribution found on almost all oceanic coastlines except in Antarctica. So, for example, the restoration efforts at the Chesapeake Bay in around Virginia is aimed at targeting, say, Zostera marina, the eelgrass. But problem is, Zostera marina also has a wide range along most coastlines in the northern hemisphere. So the question is, what happens to the eelgrass community around Georgia, around the coast of Europe, and all that? And because species don't necessarily know boundaries, so it put another way, it means that a more global effort might be required to fully safeguard, most of the seagrass communities, and also in order to keep deriving the benefits that we get from them. So
Yes.
yeah, so absolutely, and then awareness as well, just like we are talking about it now. Also,
Right.
getting people to be aware of the value and the importance of seagrasses would
Right.
also help to appreciate
Right.
and
Dr. Daru, on a couple of things on there, you say that these things like eelgrass appear to be very resilient, but that is despite the rising temperature of the oceans and despite the rising sea levels. These plants still can be resilient.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. So the by mentioning resilient, I meant to say that any kind of restoration effort would go a long way in helping seagrasses make a sort of a comeback. Now with sea level rise, meaning that as the level of seawater rises in the marine environment, seagrasses are not necessarily found at greater depths in
Right.
the marine environment. So that means that species that used to colonize very shallow waters suddenly now start to find themselves in deep waters. And so the consequence for that is that, again, the issue of light. So light getting to the bottom and other things, it might not be very straightforward for them to be able to photosynthesize, and perhaps other things like even pollination and other ecological processes. So then, even with the restoration efforts, sometimes there's a point that beyond that, there's sort of a balance. If a point that even with restoration effort, then it may not still make much meaning to the seagrass community. But I think we are still at that window where any slightest effort that we put in would still go a long way in contributing to making seagrasses come back again.
I see. So there is still a possibility, but those threats are persistent as well. The increased heat, and which seems to be, ongoing. That's not reducing, and then the inevitable at this point rise in sea level. But that brings us to another thing. I imagine that there must be species of seagrasses that are more or less adaptable. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So adaptability of seagrasses also depend on the evolutionary history of the species.
I see.
So seagrasses are not necessarily a taxonomic group, meaning that they come from different families. So they only converge to the term seagrasses because they have that sort of habit that they are submerged in marine environment. So their adaptability to climate change and all the effects of global change will also depend on their evolutionary history as well. So it's not very straightforward to determine which species might be be able to persist with effects of global change. For example, it can easily be predicted that species with very wide ranges, are likely to persist with globalization or with increasing climate change, whereas those that are very rare or specialized, found in just few places, would be expected to disappear, you know, soon as effects of global change increases. But then it's also possible that that might also depend on other factors as well. So those are some of the possible predictions or hypotheses, if you like, that can be used to explain adaptability of the seagrasses to climate change. But it's not something that's very straightforward to determine.
Right. I imagine that's of interest in research at this point, just because it's becoming so urgent, perhaps. But in any case, we've got it pretty clear now that we do have a problem. We have to have these seagrasses, and
Absolutely.
marine ecology depends upon it. The ocean, in a sense, the ocean climate all
Right.
depends on it too.
Absolutely.
They're really vital. But in terms of the great threat to them at this point, you indicate that a lot of these restorations can be effective if they really get on the ball and work on restoring these seagrasses, and that will help the coastal areas as well. And some are more adaptable than others. One other really interesting thing here before we go to some stuff about your work, your own work,
Right.
is that you alluded to this earlier of they've discovered that there are certain seagrasses that could be really good sources of food, good
Right.
sources of protein for humans. And that's coming out more in the press, I notice also. Uh,
Right.
why is that? That's full of protein.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's something really exciting that also really brightened my day when I saw the article in the Guardian as well.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so yeah, so that was it's a really, you know, it's a really good step. It's a good step in the right direction
Yes.
toward also shedding or bringing more attention to seagrasses, discovering that seagrasses are not just food for marine animals or organisms, but they can actually be food for humans as well. And so it was even found that they have some nutritional compositions that is even way more than most of the grains that we are used to eating.
Yeah.
And so I think this can also be a step forward to what there's something referred to as the orphan crop initiative. So the orphan crop initiative is some sort of a consortium that is aimed at discovering other plants that might be neglected in combating food security. For
Yeah.
example, we know that there are over 300,000 species of plants in the world, but out of these 300,000 species, only 5 feed the entire world,
Oh my
meaning,
goodness.
yeah, so only 5 species. So potatoes, rice, maize,
Oh,
wheat, and uh, perhaps
yeah.
tomatoes or something. But
Yeah.
yeah, so those are the major ones that feed the world. So almost every day we eat food that has to do with either wheat or rice or maize or potatoes somehow. And so the Orphan Crop Consortium is aimed at discovering other plants that are out there, out of this over 300,000 species that might have potential for food. And so I think the discovery of seagrasses, as a potential source of food is a really big step in this direction, especially if we kind of look back and, bear in mind that potato, rice, maize, wheat, they were also once upon a time wild plants as well.
Yes.
And so they were only eventually domesticated and we now use them for food. So why not also extend the opportunity to other species out there as well? And it's possible we might discover even ones that are much more nutritious than what we are used to. And so this discovery of seagrasses as real potential source of food is a really exciting one. And I look forward to testing it one day.
Oh.
Uh,
I understand some gourmet restaurants are already doing this,
wow.
something exotic. But the other good thing about this is that it is a no-till kind of crop. You're not wrecking the earth to produce it.
Absolutely.
And they grow very quickly and very easily. So I was amazed reading up on that a little bit. That's be something to follow definitely in the future.
Right.
I would like to turn in our few remaining minutes here to your own work, what you have been doing, and especially the methods and the that you used in order to analyze these plants, which are not just right in front of us or something.
Right.
You've got to go looking for them.
Absolutely.
How do you do this kind of research?
Right. So my interest in seagrasses is more coming from a global perspective, especially trying to look at it holistically to see where, efforts should be directed and to understand their biology in a more holistic manner.
Uh,
And so we are looking to quantify the diversity of seagrasses at the global scale. And so most of our research is aimed at looking at all 70, 72 species of seagrasses
mm,
worldwide. And so one of the immediate questions that we want to test is, well, so given that seagrasses are facing all the threats that we mentioned, pollution, climate change, human impact, range contraction, and so on. So, how is their future looking like, assuming if all these threats continue at the rate they are going, or even if they increase or
mm.
decrease, what will the future look like for seagrasses? And so we are mapping the diversity, the distribution of seagrasses now using some modeling approaches, and then we are using climate, various scenarios of climate change into the future, some future climate change projections, and then modeling the distributions into the future, say in 50 years time or in 100 years time. How will the future look like for seagrasses? So already I was quite sad, and I'm also very careful to mention this, but there's one species of the seagrass which is Haludule bermudensis. It's found only in the Bermuda region. um, it's sort of feared. I reached out to the Bermuda Institute of Oceanography, to try to find out more about the species. And it looked like the last individual that was ever collected was way back in the 19, I think the only specimen that was ever been described, even way back in the 1920s. And so I've been trying to track them down, whether there is any possible specimen of that particular species of seagrass. And we are still not making any progress along those lines. Most herbaria that I reach out to seem not to have much information. But then again, this is just too early to know what's going on for that species. But then it's possible that that can also be indicative of what's happening in other species as well. So we use herbarium records
Aha.
for understanding the distributions of seagrasses, because it's not possible to travel all around the coastlines of the world for logistic reasons, even though we would love to do that. But yeah, so we rely on herbarium records, which are actually the only data set that we have on the global distribution
Wow.
of plants. And so the nice thing with herbarium records is that they capture information of when the plant was collected, where it was collected, the day on which it was collected, and who collected it, and other information about its habitat. And so using that, one can use climate projections on that at that time and quantify the distributions of it at that time and then project it into the future. So that's sort of what we are doing, and then quantifying which species are likely to be impacted with global change. And so we are testing that even on the evolutionary history to ask the question, would adaptability, like you initially posed earlier, be dependent on the evolutionary history of the species, meaning are certain lineages of the seagrasses likely to be impacted by global change than others or not? So
Yeah.
those are some of the questions that we are using. And then more recently, we got an NSF funding from the National Science Foundation to develop computational tools that can easily analyze these data sets, especially given the fact that we are looking at it from a global perspective. And
Yes.
so the analytical tools that can be used to analyze those sort of massive data sets are not available. And so we recently got funding to develop these methods and tools to analyze these massively available data sets on seagrass distributions. And so that's a really exciting time for us and to really develop these methods and tools to understand seagrasses.
So you're right there on the frontier with all of this. I expect you're going to be, that's really going to be very valuable, that computational part. And especially when the situation is so urgent, the ability to model and project. So
Right.
I know we're going to be hearing more about your work in the coming years. And
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, Dr. Daru, we have to close now, but I really appreciate your giving us all this information. And
Thank you. And thanks for
I
having me.
yes, and I wish you the very best success, because
Thank you.
this just sounds like a real urgent kind of area. So I'm sure all of us outside will be hearing more and more about these seagrasses. They're fundamental to the planet.
Thank you.
So you're just at the right time doing this work. Thank
Absolutely.
you very much for joining us and for this wonderful information.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.